Now RFL in depth, legalizing marijuana and other marijuana-related issues. We're going to dedicate the remainder of this hour to this controversial and fast-moving subject. And it is fast-moving on a number of fronts. This year, Colorado and Washington State became the first states to allow recreational marijuana use. And voters in both Oregon and Alaska will vote on similar measures this November. The issue is also moving fast in public opinion polls. Last year, for the first time, Gallup found that a majority of Americans, in fact 58% of them, support the recreational use of marijuana. 39% say they oppose legalization. Just 4 years earlier, in 2009, only 44% supported legalization. That support is up nearly 30 points since 2001. It's up from 23% support in 1985. And back in 1969, just 12% of Americans said they thought marijuana should be legal. Here in our region, opinions appear more divided. 57% of New Yorkers say they support legalization. That from a Q poll back in February. But another Q poll in April found an even split among New Jersey residents. And then this week, the latest argument on the issue came from the New York Times editorial board. In a series of editorials, the paper came out in favor of marijuana legalization, providing a week's worth of arguments to back up their position. The board compared marijuana's status to alcohol prohibition in the 1920s, saying it is long past time to repeal this version of prohibition, adding, "We believe that on every level, health effects, the impact on society and law and order issues, the balance falls squarely on the side of national legalization." They continued, quote, "That will put decisions on whether to allow recreational or medicinal production and use where it belongs at the state level." On the role of the federal government, quote, "We considered whether it would be best for Washington to hold back while the states continued experimenting, but that would leave their citizens vulnerable to the whims of whoever happens to be in the White House and chooses to enforce or not enforce the federal law." On marijuana laws, enforcement and arrests, quote, "The result is racist, falling disproportionately on young black men, ruining their lives and creating new generations of career criminals." And finally, on the health effects of marijuana, they write, "There is honest debate among scientists, but we believe that the evidence is overwhelming that addiction and dependence are relatively minor problems, especially compared with alcohol and tobacco." Now, our goal tonight is to cut through the rhetoric and the shouting that often seems to accompany debates on marijuana reform and marijuana laws, and engage in a series of discussions on a number of related topics, including the view of law enforcement, medical marijuana, prosecutions, legalization versus decriminalization, even the value of drug testing and screening for marijuana. But let's begin with the overall debate, legalizing marijuana for recreational use. Joining us tonight is Ellen Morehouse. Ellen is the executive director of the Student Assistance Services Corporation. She is a licensed clinical social worker and a substance counselor. Ellen opposes legalizing marijuana. Thank you so much for being with us tonight. Dominic Carter, as you saw before, is here, political journalist and author. Regular viewers already know that Dominic opposes legalizing marijuana. It's a debate he and I have had many, many times. And Jill Harris is with us as well. Jill is the Managing Director of Strategic Initiatives for the Drug Policy Institute. They are a group that supports the legalization of marijuana and other reforms to marijuana and drug laws. And Ellen, I want to start with you. Your reaction to the Times piece when you read it today, or when you read it last weekend, and some of the arguments that they made, what was your reaction?
I was absolutely shocked by their failure to differentiate decriminalization from legalization, which is really commercialization. I was also appalled by their citations of out-of-date studies. I was outraged by their unbalanced reporting, and I'm really disappointed that their editorial board failed to meet with Patrick Kennedy and Kevin Sabet and well-known scientists from SAM, which is Sane Approaches to Marijuana.
What do you mean by commercialization, that legalization is the same as commercialization?
Okay. The difference between decriminalization and legalization, which you're going to discuss, is this, that if something is decriminalized, if you are stopped, if you're in violation for possession, you are not arrested. You're given a violation, just like a speeding ticket or any other motor vehicle-related issue. If it's legal, then it can be advertised and marketed, and that's exactly what will happen if marijuana is legalized. And I'm angry at the Times for not differentiating. When you showed the Gallup polls before, it was a black and white issue. Should marijuana be legalized? If you said, should marijuana be legalized or decriminalized, I'm willing to bet that the overwhelming majority of Americans would say decriminalized but not legalized.
Jill, what was your reaction to the Times piece?
Well, I think it's long overdue, and it basically the New York Times is caught up with, as you say, a majority of Americans who think it's time to end marijuana prohibition, regulate marijuana, treat it like alcohol. So I think it's long overdue. They've been very conservative in the past and very much opposed to legalization. They looked at every aspect of the issue. As you said, they wrote a series of 6 very thoughtful pieces on the different aspects of it and why it's important for each of these different reasons. I think it was very thoughtful, and I'm glad they finally caught up to the majority of Americans.
And the factual references that they made in making those arguments, you concurred with them? You've not seen?
Absolutely. I haven't seen anything to counter them. I mean, you talk about studies. There's this study that says this. There's this study that says that. First of all, let me just say about the studies. In general, studies that show these negative effects, and we're not saying that there aren't negative effects. We're not saying that marijuana is a good thing for young people. We don't think young people should have access to marijuana, but we think that's an argument for regulation rather than an argument for continued prohibition. But just about the studies, they are always about chronic use. People who smoke 4 or 5 joints a day for 20 years. I mean, these are chronic users who show these negative effects. There hasn't been a study that I know of that shows serious negative impact where it's not involved with chronic use. Sort of use from time to time, occasional use, which is what most people engage in, doesn't show those kind of negative effects.
Actually, that's incorrect, because actually the studies are divided into what are called peer-reviewed studies. Those are studies that appear in scientific peer-reviewed journals versus other kinds of studies. And there are a large number of studies that show that even casual use of marijuana can cause anxiety, it can cause other kinds of problems. It can cause a loss of motivation, it can cause impairment in coordination and impairment in memory. The New York Times' own reporter talked about using marijuana in her hotel room and how she essentially became psychotic and disoriented, and that was just casual use. One person wrote about it. It's almost like the editorial board of the New York Times doesn't pay attention to their own columnists.
But those aren't lasting effects. Maureen Dowd isn't psychotic today. She took too much, she did too much marijuana and she got over it. That doesn't lead to anxiety in somebody in a long-term way.
The point is that casual effects can cause acute symptoms, and the acute symptoms can be seriously damaging.
They are not damaging in any kind of long-term way or even a short-term way. See, this is the other thing. People have their own personal experience now. This isn't like 30 years ago, 40 years ago when these things would come up and nobody knew what they were talking about. Over half of all American adults have used marijuana at some point in their lifetime. We're talking 100 million Americans. So people have their own experience, and they know that this just isn't true.
Well, again, that's not right, because when you talk about the numbers that have used, many of the people who have use what would be called Woodstock weed, marijuana that contains 3% of THC. The marijuana that's out today is a minimum of 10% THC, and the edibles and the concentrates, the oils, are much, much higher.
So people use less. What people do is they use less.
Can I just finish? So people who are using, casual users of edibles and some of the other products, are going to emergency rooms. They're having impaired driving related crashes, fatal crashes. I mean, the statistics are very clear.
Ellen, we're just about out of time this time, but I'm curious why marijuana gets a different treatment than, let's say, alcohol. Alcohol certainly has its own side effects. It has its own potential health risks. Why not empower people to make those choices for themselves?
Here's exactly the reason why. Because someone can go out and have a glass of wine with their steak dinner, and if they weigh 150 pounds and they consume that glass of wine over the course of an hour, they're not even going to feel a buzz. There isn't one person I ever met, or I'm sure that anyone listening will know, who uses marijuana just to take a tote or a puff, whatever. People smoke marijuana to get high. That's like saying drinking to get drunk. So if we're talking about alcohol versus marijuana, then we're talking about alcoholics versus marijuana users, not just using alcohol, because alcohol can be used as a beverage to accompany a meal without getting high.
I want to cut it off here because I want to move on to the next subject, and we're going to take a quick break here. Quick reminder at home, head over to Facebook and Twitter, sound off on today's question: should recreational marijuana be legal? And up next, the concerns of law enforcement. Michael Rinaldi, the president of the New York State Association of Police Chiefs, he's been fighting to keep marijuana off our streets for 30 years. Now he's fighting those who say it should be legal. His take is next on RFL.